They say you could hear it from Stillwater, 5 miles downstream. A sound like sustained thunder, a grinding roar that didn't stop, that built and built until the windows rattled in the mill offices, and men ran outside to see what was happening. What was happening was that the St. Croix River, the timber highway between Minnesota and Wisconsin, had just locked up solid. 2 miles of river gorge, from Angle Rock to the Dalles, choked with logs stacked 40 feet high in places. A dam of timber so massive that the river behind it was rising 6 inches an hour, and the mills downstream were about to run dry. 150 million board feet of pine. That's the equivalent of building material for 15,000 houses, or enough timber to lay a boardwalk from New York to San Francisco. It was worth $3 million in 1886 money, roughly $90 million today, and it was stuck, locked in a tangle so complex that every attempt to move one log just tightened the grip on 1,000 others. The companies were facing bankruptcy, the towns were facing collapse, and the only solution anyone could think of was dynamite, which had never been used on a logjam before because the risk of killing everyone involved was essentially guaranteed. This is the story of the Great St. Croix Jam of 1886. How a winter of record snow and a late ice out created a timber traffic jam of apocalyptic scale. How men died trying to break it with hand tools and brute force. How engineers finally resorted to explosives, turning a logging operation into a battlefield. And how the disaster changed the way America moved timber, writing regulations in blood and splintered wood that are still in effect today. But to understand how 150 million board feet of timber ended up wedged in a river gorge, we need to rewind to the winter of 1885 and the spring that wouldn't come. The St. Croix River forms part of the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's a working river, not a scenic one, though the gorge section between Taylor's Falls and Stillwater has a raw beauty: high basalt cliffs, narrow channels, rapids that churn white even in low water. In the 1880s, this river was an industrial artery. Every pine log cut in the forests of northern Wisconsin and eastern Minnesota came down the St. Croix on the spring drive. The logging companies, the St. Croix Boom Company, the Eau Claire Lumber Company, the Stillwater Logging Consortium, depended on it absolutely. There were no railroads deep enough into the pine forests yet, no roads that could handle heavy freight. The river was the only option. A normal year saw 70 to 80 million board feet move down the St. Croix between April and June. The logs were cut during winter, skidded to the riverbanks, and stacked. When the ice went out in early April, the logs were rolled into the water and the drive began. Crews of river pigs guided the timber downstream, breaking jams, keeping the flow moving, delivering the logs to the sorting booms at Stillwater, where they'd be divided by company mark and sent to the mills. It was a system that worked, barely, and only when everything went right. 1886 was the year everything went wrong. The winter of 1885 to 86 brought snow measured in feet, not inches. The forests of the St. Croix watershed got buried. Snowpack in the pine country north of Grantsburg, Wisconsin, reached 6 feet in places. That much snow meant that much water, waiting. The logging camps worked through it. More snow meant better ice roads, easier skidding. The volume of logs staged on the riverbanks that winter was the highest on record. The companies were competing, each trying to cut more than the others, racing to meet demand from the booming cities of the Midwest. Chicago was rebuilding after the fire. Minneapolis and St. Paul were exploding in population. The demand for pine was unlimited, and the companies were determined to deliver. By March, the riverbanks along the upper St. Croix and its tributaries, the Namakagon, the Yellow, the Kettle, were lined with timber. Millions of logs, stacked and waiting. Then the ice wouldn't leave. A normal spring ice out on the St. Croix happens in early April, sometimes late March. The ice cracks, breaks up, floats downstream in a dramatic few days of grinding chaos, and then the river runs clear and the drive can start. But spring 1886 was cold. March stayed frozen. April came and the ice held. The companies were panicking. Every day of delay was a day of lost revenue. The mills downstream were running out of inventory. Contracts were at risk. Finally, in the third week of April, the temperature spiked. The ice went out fast. Too fast. In a violent breakup that sent chunks the size of wagons grinding downstream, scouring the banks, smashing anything in the way. And the moment the ice cleared, the companies started rolling logs. Every company, all at once, desperate to make up for lost time. The upper tributaries, narrow and fast, filled with timber. Millions of logs hit the main channel of the St. Croix in the span of a week, a concentrated surge that the river couldn't handle. The drive crews were overwhelmed. There weren't enough men to manage the flow. Jams formed, and were broken and formed again. The logs pushed downstream in a chaotic mass. No spacing, no control. Just a torrent of timber riding the high water from the snowmelt. And then they hit Angle Rock. Angle Rock is a basalt outcrop on the inside of a sharp bend in the river, about 10 miles upstream from Stillwater. The channel narrows there from 200 feet to less than 100. The current is fast on the outside of the bend, slow on the inside. It's a natural choke point, a place where jams form in normal years and have to be broken quickly before they back up. On April 23, 1886, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, a large pine, estimated later at 40 feet long and 3 feet in diameter, came down the river slightly off-center. It caught on Angle Rock, swung sideways in the current, and wedged. The logs behind it, pushed by the current and the weight of the logs behind them, piled up. Within minutes, the river was blocked. Within an hour, the jam extended a quarter-mile upstream. The sound, that grinding roar, was the sound of logs colliding, interlocking, being forced together by unstoppable hydraulic pressure. Witnesses on the cliffs above the gorge reported that the jam grew visibly, foot by foot, as they watched. By nightfall, the jam was half a mile long. By morning, it was a mile. The river behind it was rising, flooding the banks, backing up into the tributaries, and still the logs kept coming. The crews upstream didn't know the river was blocked. They kept pushing timber into the water, feeding the jam. It took 2 days for word to travel up the line and for the upstream drives to be halted. By then, the damage was done. When the first surveyors reached Angle Rock on April 26th and climbed the cliffs to get a vantage point, what they saw defied belief. The jam extended from Angle Rock downstream, through the entire gorge section, a distance of just over 2 miles. The width varied from 100 feet at the narrowest point to 300 feet where the gorge widened. The depth was impossible to measure accurately, but based on the height of logs piled above the waterline and knowledge of the river depth, estimates ranged from 30 to 50 feet of timber. The surveyors did the math. Volume of the jam, length times width times estimated depth, minus the voids between logs, estimated packing efficiency. The numbers were staggering. 150 million board feet, conservative estimate. It could have been more. The weight, assuming green pine at about 60 pounds per cubic foot, was over 200,000 tons. 200,000 tons of timber, wedged into a river gorge, held in place by friction and the interlocking chaos of 100,000 individual logs. The companies converged on Stillwater for an emergency meeting. Representatives from every logging firm on the St. Croix, mill owners, boom company officials, engineers. The economic stakes were existential. That timber represented the majority of the year's cut. If it couldn't be freed and delivered, mills would close, workers would be laid off, towns would collapse. The companies had borrowed against expected revenue, banks were involved. This wasn't just a logging problem, it was a financial crisis. The boom company, which held the contract for managing the river, was technically responsible. But the boom company had never faced anything like this. Their standard methods, crews with PVs and cant dogs, worked for jams 100 feet long, maybe 200. A 2-mile jam was beyond their capacity. Still, they had to try. The call went out for men. Every river pig in the region was hired. Crews were assembled. 160 men by the end of the first week. Wages doubled to $4 a day. They arrived at the jam site with their tools and their experience, and a growing sense that this was going to be bad. The first attempt was conventional. Identify the key logs at the downstream end, the ones holding the structure. Pull them or cut them, release the pressure, let the jam flow out naturally. The crews worked from shore and from the logs themselves, moving carefully over the unstable mass. The jam boss, a French-Canadian named Louis Babot, had 25 years of experience. He'd broken jams on the Penobscot, the Wisconsin, the Chippewa. He was the best in the business. Babot studied the jam for a day before making his assessment. There was no single key log. The jam was too big, too interlocked. It wasn't a jam in the traditional sense. It was a dam, a structure that had achieved a kind of terrible stability. Pulling logs from the downstream end didn't release pressure. It just created voids that the logs above filled immediately. He told the company representatives that this was going to take weeks, and that men were going to die. He was right on both counts. The work was grinding and dangerous. Teams of men would identify a section, work to loosen it, pry and pull and lever with cant dogs and PVs. Sometimes they'd free a dozen logs, sometimes 100. But the jam was being fed from behind. The river pressure was immense. Water was flowing through the jam, finding channels between logs, eroding the structure in some places and tightening it in others. The logs shifted constantly, unpredictably. Men working on the surface would feel the mass move beneath them and have seconds to get clear before a section collapsed or rolled. On May 2nd, day 9 of the jam, a crew was working a tight cluster near the center of the gorge. 8 men, prying at a log that seemed to be a pressure point. The log came free suddenly. The section above it, maybe 50 logs, shifted and rolled. 5 men scrambled clear. 3 didn't. James Corrigan, age 24, from Stillwater, was caught between 2 rolling logs. The impact crushed his chest. He died before they could pull him out. Peter Boudreau and Anton Swenson were thrown into the water in the chaos. The logs above them tumbled into the gap. Boudreau's body was recovered 3 days later, a mile downstream. Swenson was never found. The work continued. There was no pause, no memorial. The bodies were noted in the ledger, and the crews went back to the jam. By mid-May, after 3 weeks of labor, the jam had been reduced by an estimated 10%. 15 million board feet released. 135 million still stuck. At the current rate, it would take 6 months to clear. The companies didn't have 6 months. The mills were shut down. Workers were being laid off. The financial pressure was crushing. Someone suggested dynamite. Exactly who is unclear from the surviving records. Some accounts credit a mining engineer from the Iron Range named Thomas Owens. Others say it was a company executive, desperate and grasping. What's certain is that the suggestion was initially rejected as insane. Dynamite was dangerous, unpredictable, and using it on a logjam could kill the entire crew. But as May wore on and progress stalled, insanity started to look like pragmatism. On May 19th, the company bosses authorized the purchase of 500 pounds of dynamite. It was shipped in from the Hercules Powder Company in Wilmington, Delaware, a 10-day journey by rail. While they waited for the explosives, the hand crews kept working. and kept dying. On May 21st, a cable being used to pull a section of the jam snapped under load. The cable whipped back across the jam surface, moving faster than the eye could follow. It caught Tomas Delacroix across the legs, severing both limbs below the knee. He bled out in minutes. On May 24th, a jam section let go without warning. The release was explosive, logs tumbling into the river, the whole mass shifting. 2 men went into the water. One, Michael O'Shea, managed to grab a floating log and was pulled out downstream, hypothermic but alive. The other, a man named Carl Jensen, was pulled under and crushed. His body surfaced 4 days later, barely recognizable. The crews were exhausted, terrified, and angry. They were being paid well, but no amount of money compensates for watching your friends die. There was talk of walking off, of refusing to work until conditions improved. But conditions couldn't improve. The jam was the condition. Babot held the crews together through sheer force of personality, and the knowledge that if they quit, the companies would just bring in new men. At least the current crews were experienced. Green men would die even faster. The dynamite arrived on May 30th, 500 pounds in 50-pound crates, waxed sticks packed in sawdust. It came with a blasting engineer, a company man named Robert Haas, who had experience with dynamite in railroad construction and mine work. He'd never used it on a log jam. No one had. Haas spent a day studying the jam and conferring with Babot. The plan they developed was simple in concept. Identify structural points, places where the jam was locked tight. Drill holes into the logs at those points, pack them with dynamite, run fuse lines, and detonate. The explosion would shatter the logs, break the lock, and allow that section of the jam to flow. In theory, in practice, every step was lethal. Drilling into a floating, shifting log required climbing out onto the jam, positioning yourself on an unstable surface, and using a hand auger to bore a hole 2 or 3 inches in diameter and a foot deep. The logs were wet, hard, and prone to rolling while you worked. Then you had to pack the hole with dynamite sticks, tamp them down, insert a blasting cap, and run a fuse line back to shore. And you had to do all of this knowing that if the jam shifted while you were out there, you could be crushed, drowned, or blown apart if your charge detonated prematurely. The first blast was set for June 1st. 3 charges, placed in what Haas identified as key logs near the downstream end of the jam. The charges were small, 10 pounds each, because no one knew what the logs would do when they exploded. The fuses were lit. The crews retreated to shore. The explosion was loud, sharp cracks that echoed off the gorge walls. The logs splintered, debris flew 100 feet into the air, and the jam shifted. A section maybe 50 feet long loosened and began to move. Then it stopped. The logs downstream, still jammed tight, caught the moving section and held it. The blast had created a new configuration, but hadn't released anything. Haas adjusted. The next day, he placed charges deeper in the jam, targeting logs he thought were holding the mass. Bigger charges, 20 pounds. The blasts worked better. Sections of the jam broke apart. Logs began to flow downstream. Not a flood, just a trickle, but it was movement. The crews cheered. The companies sent telegrams celebrating progress. But the jam was learning, if a structure can learn. As the downstream sections cleared, the remaining jam compressed, tightened, became denser and more stable. The blasts that had worked at first were less effective as the days went on. Haas started using larger charges, 30 pounds, 40. The explosions became more violent. Logs didn't just break, they disintegrated, sending splinters the size of spears flying across the gorge. The danger to the crews increased exponentially. On June 7th, a blast went wrong. Haas and a team of 3 men were placing a charge deep in the jam near the center of the gorge. The charge was a big one, 50 pounds, intended to break a massive knot of logs that had resisted smaller blasts. They drilled the hole, packed the dynamite, set the fuse. The fuse was supposed to be a 10-minute burn, giving them time to get clear. Something went wrong. A spark, a short fuse, a defect in the blasting cap. The charge detonated early. Haas was 70 feet away, running for shore when it went off. The concussion knocked him down, but he survived. The three men still on the jam, placing a second charge, were at the center of the blast. The explosion vaporized the logs they were standing on, and them with it. Body parts were found scattered across the jam site over the next 2 days. An arm, a torso, pieces too small to identify. The dead were George Patterson, age 31, Andrew Holm, age 26, and Joseph Renard, age 19. The company records list them as killed by accidental detonation. There was no investigation. The blasting continued. By mid-June, the pace of clearing had increased. The combination of hand crews working the edges and dynamite blasts breaking the interior was grinding the jam down. Sections that had been locked for 2 months were flowing. The river downstream was clogged with moving timber, a chaotic mass, but it was moving. The mills in Stillwater started up again, processing the logs that were finally arriving. But the jam wasn't done. On June 17th, a secondary jam formed a half-mile downstream from the original site. The logs freed from the upper jam hit a narrow section of river and locked up again. This jam was smaller, maybe 20 million board feet, but it threatened to stop all progress. The crews, already exhausted, had to shift focus. The secondary jam was broken in 4 days using the techniques they'd learned. Smaller charges, precisely placed, followed by immediate hand crew work to keep the logs moving. It worked, but it was a grim reminder that the river was in control and the men were just reacting. The final major blast happened on June 23rd. Haas had identified a core section of the original jam, a mass of logs so tightly interlocked that it had resisted every attempt to move it. He decided to use 100 pounds of dynamite, the largest charge yet, placed at the base of the knot, deep in the water. The charge was set by a 4-man team working from a bateau, the flat-bottomed boat positioned next to the jam. They drilled into the submerged logs, packed the charge, ran the fuse up to the surface and back to shore. The fuse was a 15-minute burn. Haas lit it himself, then everyone ran. 15 minutes later, the gorge exploded. The blast was massive, felt a mile away. A column of water and splintered wood shot 50 feet into the air. The concussion shattered windows in a farmhouse on the cliff above the river. And the jam moved. The core knot disintegrated. The logs above it dropped into the void, then shifted, then began to flow. Not a trickle this time, a flood. The entire remaining mass of the jam, still tens of millions of board feet, started to move. The sound was a roar, continuous and building. Logs accelerated, tumbling over each other, grinding and splintering. The crews on shore watched as the gorge emptied. It took 6 hours for the main mass to pass. By nightfall, on June 23rd, the St. Croix River was running clear for the first time in 2 months. The jam was broken. But the cost was brutal. Official company records list 7 men killed during the clearing operation. Newspaper accounts from Stillwater and Taylor's Falls put the number at 11, including men who died from injuries days after the accidents and were not counted in the official tally. The economic cost was staggering, $3 million in timber value, but the delays had cost more. Mills shut down for weeks, workers laid off, contracts defaulted. The total economic impact to the region was estimated at $5 million, over $150 million today. The companies absorbed the losses, but the financial strain triggered consolidations. Smaller firms were bought out. The industry concentrated into fewer, larger companies with more capital reserves to weather disasters. What changed operationally was significant. The the St. Croix Boom Company rewrote its protocols. Splash dams were built on the upper tributaries to control the flow of logs, releasing them in manageable surges instead of all at once. Boom systems were reinforced and expanded downstream to catch and sort logs more efficiently, reducing the risk of jams forming in the gorge. And dynamite became a standard tool. The techniques developed by Haas during the 1886 jam became the basis for jam clearing operations across the industry. Blasting crews were trained, procedures were written. The use of explosives in logging, which had been experimental and desperate in '86, became routine. What remains today is fragmentary. The St. Croix River still runs through the gorge, now a protected scenic waterway, part of the National Wild and Scenic Rivers system. You can paddle through the section where the jam formed. The cliffs are the same. Angle Rock is still there. But the river is quiet. There are no log drives. The last commercial timber run on the St. Croix was in the early 1950s. In low water years, submerged logs from the 1880s still surface. They've been underwater for over a century, preserved by the cold and the tannins in the water. Divers and fishermen find them, massive old-growth pines, still solid, still bearing the axe marks and company stamps from the cutting camps of 1885. These logs are physical remnants of the jam, timber that was freed but never recovered, that sank and stayed. The gorge itself bears scars. If you know where to look, you can see impact marks on the basalt cliffs, gouges where logs under immense pressure scraped the rock. You can find blast marks, places where Haas set charges against the cliff face to break log clusters. The rock is scorched, fractured in patterns that don't occur naturally. There are a few photographs. Glass plate images from the summer of 1886, showing the jam from the cliffs above. The images are grainy, low contrast, but the scale is visible. The river choked with timber. The logs stacked so densely they look like solid ground. Tiny figures of men are visible on the jam surface, giving scale. They look impossibly small. The jam looks impossibly large. The men who worked it are gone. Louis Babot, the jam boss, died in 1904, in his 60s, having survived a career that should have killed him a dozen times. Robert Haas, the blasting engineer, moved on to railroad work and died in a tunnel collapse in Colorado in 1892. Most of the river pigs left no records. They were laborers, anonymous, their names appearing only in company ledgers and a few newspaper accounts of their deaths. The towns remember in a vague way. Stillwater has a small museum with a log driving exhibit. There are old tools on display, peaveys and cant dogs. There are photographs and a brief text panel about the 1886 jam. But the details have faded. The scale of the disaster, the desperation of the clearing operation, the men who died, it's all been compressed into a footnote, a historical curiosity. We've forgotten how to comprehend disasters at this scale. 150 million board feet is a number too big to visualize. 200,000 tons of timber locked in a river gorge sounds like fiction. The idea that men would climb onto that mass with hand tools and dynamite, knowing they'd probably die, and do it for $4 a day, is outside the framework of modern labor relations. But it happened. The photographs prove it. The scars in the rock prove it. The logs still surfacing prove it. And the lesson, if there is one, is that the forces we thought we controlled, the rivers, the forests, the timber economy, were always bigger than we understood. The St. Croix Jam of 1886 was a moment when nature reminded the industry that the river was not a machine, that logs were not widgets, and that the men working the drives were gambling with physics that didn't care about profit margins or delivery schedules. The companies learned and adapted. The blasting protocols, the boom systems, the splash dams, they worked. Jams of that scale didn't happen again on the St. Croix. But the cost of that knowledge was 11 men dead, millions in losses, and a summer when an entire region held its breath and waited to see if dynamite and desperation could break a dam made of a forest. So here's to Louis Bobo and the 160 river pigs who worked the jam. Here's to Robert Haas and the blasting crews who invented a technique while standing on a ticking bomb. Here's to James Corrigan and Peter Boudreau and Anton Swenson and Thomas Delacroix and Carl Jensen and George Patterson and Andrew Holm and Joseph Renard and the others whose names were never recorded. Here's to the men who climbed onto 2 miles of unstable timber in a river gorge and tried to move it with iron bars and muscle, and when that failed, with explosives that could kill them as easily as free the logs. They broke the jam. They cleared the river. They did the impossible work under impossible conditions, and the river ran clear because they made it run. One log, one blast, one body at a time. The St. Croix is quiet now. The gorge is peaceful. But the rock remembers the blast marks, and the river, in its cold depths, still holds the logs that never made it to the mill. Monuments in wood and stone to the spring when the timber industry met a force it couldn't control and paid the blood price to break it.